Good evening, everyone. I am always loath to interrupt lively conversations of any kind. But for tonight, it is with great pleasure to introduce our Sophia Lecturer, Professor Douglas Hedley of the University of Cambridge, who is going to deliver the third of his 5 lectures in our inaugural Sophia Lecture series. This lecture series is devoted to the exploration of perennial questions of philosophy. Let's call them ultimate questions. As those questions bear on the meaning and value of modern life. While this lecture series aims to make sense of our contemporary moment, it does so through the study of Western culture's foundational texts, ideas, and spiritual insights. Those of you who have had the privilege of hearing one or both of the first 2 lectures will know what a wonderful intellectual journey Dr. Hedley has taken us on from ancient times to the present, as he has explored the theme of play in all of its forms. Dr. Hedley comes to us from the University of Cambridge, where he is a professor in the philosophy of religion in the Faculty of Divinity and a fellow of long-standing at the very beautiful Clare College. There's much more that we could say and will be said at other occasions about Dr. Hedley, but I am extremely eager to have you join me in welcoming him here to give his third lecture.
Stephen, well, thank you as ever for your kind and generous words. The students visited Ephesus at the beginning of the academic year, and I wish to start with a cryptic utterance from that notoriously obscure philosopher Heraclitus, with what Charles Kahn describes as the most enigmatic of Heraclitean riddles. And of course, you'll all know that I'm referring to fragment B52 of the Dios Cans, Aion pais esti paizon pezoion paidos he basilee. The Lerb translation is given as time is a child, the pais, playing, well, it's translated in Lerb as drafts. Of course, we don't know exactly what the board game was, but some sort of board game. The kingship is a child's. That's the genitive, the paidos. Now, what does this mean? And indeed, many great philosophers have been exploring this enigmatic sentence. You'll find Nietzsche, you'll find Heidegger, among others, who were fascinated by this rather enigmatic line. We could say maybe it's a lifetime. Aion in pre-Socratic Greek seems to mean a life rather than eternity, as the meaning it has in Plato. So does it mean a lifetime, time, or eternity is nothing but a child playing checkers or drafts? Kingship belonging to the child. Does this mean that living like a child is somehow to live like a king? Or is it a claim about the universe, that all is chance? Perhaps it's a deliberate paradox. We noted last week the difference between play and games in our discussion of Wittgenstein and how Wittgenstein spoke about language games, but in his German he was using the term Sprachspiele, and Sprachspiele, the German word Spiel, means both play and game. Now, some games are very sophisticated, and indeed, the board game here may be indeed a model of adult sophistication. And those of you who know the enigmatic Heraclitus will know that rather like Nicholas of Cusa, the German mystic of the Renaissance period, he's very fond of the coincidence of opposites. So maybe we've got a coincidence of opposites here, that existence is characterized by the contrary attributes, and the child playing this very complex adult board game is an instance of that. Now, Wordsworth, of course, said that the child is the father of the man. But childhood is a very paradoxical standard for wisdom and rather puzzling as a clue to life. But let me present you a passage from Plato, from the Laws. According to the story, pretty well every young creature is incapable of keeping quiet, either physically or vocally. It has to be trying to move and make sounds all the time. This is a very schoolmasterly Plato of the rather late Laws. Now jumping and skipping, dancing for pleasure, for example, or playing games, now uttering all kinds of sounds. Other creatures have no perception of order or disorder, what we call rhythm and harmony in these motions. But in our case, the gods, we said, have been given to us to be our companions in the dance. They are also the ones who have given us the ability to take pleasure in the perception of rhythm and harmony. So that's from the second book of the Laws, 653d to 654a. Now, Plato seems to be saying that children are naturally irrepressible and exuberant, but they need to channel this disordered energy into a structured and harmonious manner, that exemplified by the gods. And further on in the Laws, we read Plato saying, "So a life spent in peace is what each of us should live out as much as best we can. What is then the right way of so living? To spend one's whole life in play. In fact, specifically in sacrificing, singing, dancing, so as to be able both to ensure that the gods smile on one and to resist and defeat one's enemies if it comes to a fight." So that's a famous passage from the Laws 803e. Hence, for Plato, in his rather authoritarian later work, The Laws, play becomes the telos of all human life. In the Laws, this is in the ritual worship of the gods, in sacrifices, in music, and in dance. Now, what does Plato mean here? Well, one, I think, convincing interpretation is that the habitual concerns of many, sensual pleasure, ambition, wealth, war, don't mean very much from the perspective of the divine. On the contrary, play as the measured attunement with the divine is the really serious stuff of life. And it's this paradoxical relationship of play to seriousness that is so central to Hausinger's discussion of Plato in Homo Ludens. Now, last week, we looked at the question of meaning in language and concluded that meaning cannot be generated by human conventions, by meaning as use, in the sense of Wittgenstein's game, but only on the assumption that meaning is grounded in the logos. And indeed, the transformation of consciousness through poetic language that we find asserted by figures like Barfield, which words are only themselves by being more than themselves, is a characteristic aspect of this claim. Hausinger writes with characteristic verve and power, "If a serious statement is defined as one that may be made in terms of waking life, poetry will never rise to the level of seriousness. It lies beyond seriousness, on that more primitive and original level where the child, the animal, the savage, and the seer belong. In the region of dream, enchantment, ecstasy, laughter." And here, and note this concluding line of the passage, which I think is so beautiful. To understand poetry, we must be capable of donning the child's soul like a magic cloak and of forsaking man's wisdom for the child's. Now, it's this idea that we wish to pursue in tonight's lecture. And I think this notion is of pressing significance in the cultural context, especially in the university and the controversies surrounding free speech. One of the frequent justifications, trigger warnings, cancellations, are in terms of mental health, trauma, or even suicide risk. The recent surge in mental health problems may be viewed in light of a great cultural shift. It's often claimed that ancient philosophy was concerned with happiness. And there's a key word in ancient philosophy, sophrosune, which means moderation, temperance, self-control. But one could also translate the word, as I say this with some trepidation with Dr. Conlon in the back of the hall, one could also translate the word as mental health. Because lying behind this concern with sophrosune is a profound sense of human misery. The recent emphasis upon self-esteem in the broader culture and education has often been negative, where encouraging self-esteem has been the widespread bolstering of, I'm afraid, failure and mediocrity. The traditional goal of the intellectual and spiritual life is to become worthy of esteem. And the first step there is to recognize one's inadequacies and to attempt to remedy them. Now, one of the arguments for the removal of statues and plaques, moreover, has been the alleged effect upon the mental health of passers-by. Yet, here we're dealing with a very puzzling background concept. I think with this concept of mental health, we've experienced a migration from a spiritual state of the soul to a medical diagnosis. Depression has replaced melancholy in the English language. Of course, melancholy is the language of the soul and is linked to Saturn. Depression is a medical concept. Indeed, Victorian melancholy often has a religious tone. Think of Matthew Arnold's wonderful words, that the sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar. In the last decade or so, there's been a heightened awareness, of course, of the problems associated with depression. But what is in fact health? Physical health is very hard to define, but let us think of it as the capacity to work and play with little hindrance through illness or disease. We're generally unaware of bodily health. It's its absence that's felt so forcibly. The health of the mind is altogether more elusive. Shakespeare notes that nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Milton tells us that the human mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. I'm not sure whether these are apt words in the beautiful surroundings of Savannah, but they certainly are for some other beautiful cities I can think of. Now, one can think of various instances of mental illness, but it's not clear what forms of unhappiness count as illness. Agoraphobia, I suppose, might be an example of neurotic illness, schizophrenia, an example of pathology. Freud once observed that the task of therapy was to transform neurotic unhappiness into normal unhappiness. Stress, depression, anxiety are, of course, emotional states, and some of these clearly have a biological base. Fear and anxiety, for example, are clearly important instruments in survival. But the great gift of self-conscious reflection in a human being can be a scourge. And in highly developed, affluent countries, one encounters less of a heaven created out of a hell than a making a hell of heaven. Perhaps it's better to impart in children a sense that the human condition is complex, that misery is pervasive and happiness often elusive. And perhaps the best antidote to suffering is a life of meaning and purpose, in which the humanities play a significant role. not, as the postmodern ideologues insist, by unmasking the most innocent and constructive practices as the masking of raw power, but through exploring the great themes and problems of human existence and value. As Achilles says to Priam in the Iliad, of the two jars that are man's fate, of ills and blessings. For on this the wise of the gods spun the thread for wretched mortals, that they should live in pain, and themselves are sorrowless. The two urns are set upon the floor of Zeus of gifts that he giveth, one of ills, the other of blessings. To whomsoever Zeus, that hurleth the thunderbolt, giveth a mingled lot, that man meeteth now with evil, now with good, but to whomsoever he giveth but of the baneful, him he maketh to be reviled of man, and direful madness driveth him over the face of the sacred earth, and he wandereth honoured neither of gods nor mortals. So to know one's mind is clear to the ancients is a taxing and difficult business. Long before Freud and the modern psychologists, the greatest philosophers of antiquity, has represented self-knowledge as particularly puzzling and demanding. And the unrealistic expectations of contemporary culture and its yearning for happiness and the marginalization of the tested and tried spiritual teachings of Christianity in the West, I think, has generated a real crisis. The utopian demands of the social justice warriors are, of course, unsustainable and will generate, I think, ever more social bitterness and division. Now, while the English word mad is from the Old English gemed, literally demented, health is from health, wholeness, sound, well-being. It's linked to obviously the word hail. Salus in Latin is welfare, prosperity, and of course the source of our word, salvation. And I think the link between healing and the holy is vital here. There's a spiritual dimension that cannot be addressed just by technology, whereas poetry can ambush the heart. As Coleridge says, the poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity. And that's bringing the whole soul that technology, for all its wonders, cannot achieve. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, in The Coddling of the American Mind, have written in a most perceptive manner and in a way that addresses the spiritual sclerosis of the age about the question of play. And they describe changes in childhood in the West, like the emergence of fearful parenting, the erosion of unsupervised child group play, together with the impact of social media. So the argument is, in a way, that the erosion of play at the level of the childhood stage has exacerbated and reinforced the fragility of young adults. They write, the notion that a university should protect all of its students from ideas that some of them find offensive is a repudiation of the legacy of Socrates, who described himself as the gadfly of the Athenian people. He thought it was his job to sting, disturb, to question, and thereby to provoke his fellow Athenians to think through their current beliefs and to change the ones they could not defend. So that's a quote from The Coddling of the American Mind. So with this context in mind, I want to turn to one of the major British psychologists of the 20th century, and one who has, I think, very significant things to say about the significance of play in terms of mental health broadly conceived. Donald Winnicott, 1896 to 1971, was a highly distinguished therapist working particularly with children, and he's famous for his notion of transitional objects, which he develops in a rather short book called Playing and Reality. It was published by Penguin in 1971. Now, behind the rather plain prose and the clinical accent of his observations As I say, I think this is the most profound theory of play and its significance for the human condition. Now, play for Winnicott refers to the play of infants and older children, but also the recreational activities of adults, hobbies, sport, anything where an adult has a sense of spontaneity and joie de vivre. Hausinger speaks of a game as a magic circle. And this relates to what is of interest, obviously, to the player. And play for Winnicott is about being and a sense of being. In many respects, Winnicott here is critical of Freud, especially the mechanistic theory of drives, the attaining of pleasure, the avoidance of pain. And contrary to Freud, one of the key concepts for Winnicott is creativity. Whereas Freud thinks that creativity is driven by neurosis, think, for example, of his wonderful analysis of Leonardo, but nevertheless, what is driving artistic activity is compensation. The creative impulse is driven by the longing for wealth, power, or prestige, and it's this model of creativity that Winnicott is hostile to. But let me turn to this idea of transitional objects. So he develops this idea of transitional objects, which are a rather fancy term for rather basic child items like blankets, teddy bears. They're basically items that enable the child to develop a sense of independence from the mother. But he draws an inference from this observation with the child. Play enables us, and I'm quoting him here, to hover between the third part of life of a human being, a part that we cannot ignore, an intermediate area of experiencing to which inner reality and external life both contribute. So the thought is that the transitional object, let's say the teddy bear, which is a means by which the child is able to distance himself from the mother, also comes to represent objects which remain significant for the adult, which are somehow mediating inner reality and external life. So the healthy child, Winnicott thinks, can forget himself or herself through play, given a protecting environment. I mean, that's something noted by a number of these psychologists, that play requires a certain amount of security, whereas the troubled child is concerned unduly with self-preservation, and damaged children lose the capacity to play. But Winnicott is trying to draw some inferences from these observations, these clinical observations about children, which develop this idea of transitional objects into the adult realm, and even ontological or theological questions. So he even considers the Eucharist as an example of a transitional object, symbolizing the union of two separate things at the same point in time and space of the initiation into a state of separateness. Liturgy becomes a sort of intermediate area. Art is another transitional object where he thinks that we can explore elements of the self that are truncated in habitual relations, and art provides us this transitional intermediary space. He can be rather paradoxical. He says, play is really adult. Children are learning about it. And again, here it's a critique of Freud's pessimism. Whereas Freud has a sense of the imagination as compensatory fantasy, like the Romantics, Winnicott thinks that imagination is truth-bearing. So not sublimation, but for Winnicott, we learn something about the world through imagination. Another key distinction here is between what he calls the true and the false self. Now, such a contrast is rather cursory in Winnicott. He's not a philosopher. He's merely using these distinctions in his clinical context. And as you might imagine, he has been subjected to quite a lot of critique, not least because of the zeal for deconstruction of the very idea of the self in postmodernism and critical theory. But the crucial question for Winnicott is about the relationship between appearance and our inner being. So the notion is basically this, that the false self is a protective instrument. The word person, of course, is derived from the Latin persona, and this word means mask. It's a term used in a legal context, but primarily in the theatre. And Winnicott, like Freud, like Jung rather as well, thinks we need masks. There is, of course, the question of trust. We can't reveal all about ourselves. And of course, the child, when the child is being acclimatized, is being enculturated, the child is learning how to acquire a mask. But this false self is not the mauvaise foi of the existentialists, the self repudiated by Jean-Paul Sartre and others as merely a conformist bourgeois society. The self is in a way a necessary appearance, what Schiller called shine. It's not so much deception as survival mechanism. As Goethe's Mignon states, "So lass mich scheinen, bis ich werde." So let me appear until I become. Well, this is very much the idea lying behind Jung when he says that the true self can't emerge without the shine, without the appearance of the mask or the persona. And both Winnicott and Jung are impressed by the ways that human beings develop masks. So this is lying behind Jung's theory of individuation and Winnicott's whole notion of the false or the true self. And I believe this reinforces the argument of Hausinger. Children who cannot play cannot connect with reality as adults. And instance of this would be narcissists to psychopaths who are disconnected in various ways from the world. Yet, there are some agents who cannot take off the mask. For Winnicott, play for adults furnishes a way of reconnecting with the true self. Again, we find the critique of Freud. Freud, in Civilization and its Discontents, of course, presents the conscious self, the I, as caught between the superego, the constraints of society, and the unconscious cauldron of lusts and aggressive desires in the id, which are revealed by daydreams, slips of the tongue, etc. But the true self of Winnicott is linked to creativity. He writes, "The creativity that concerns me is universal. It belongs to being alive." He writes further, "If individuals live creatively and feel that life is worth living, the true self is spontaneous gesture." Now, Winnicott does not mean, of course, that we all need to be artists, but he thinks we need to feel connected to a meaningful source in life. And this is linked to a certain romantic tradition that he's picking up on, particularly Wordsworth. Consider the lines in Wordsworth on Spots of Time, where he says, "There are in our existence spots of time which with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue, whence, depressed by false opinion and contentious thought, or aught of heavier or more deadly weight, in trivial occupations and round of ordinary intercourse, our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired." Wordsworth's notion of the mind being nourished and invisibly repaired by such life-affirming moments of joy is, if not the direct source of Winnicott's therapeutic ideas, at least a shaping factor. Turn to another psychologist after considering Winnicott briefly, and that's Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961. But I'm going to start with a quotation from Lord Bacon, where he says of poetry, "It is as a dream of learning, a thing sweet and varied that would be thought to have in it something divine, a character which dreams likewise affect. That's probably a surprisingly beautiful remark by indeed the most eloquent Bacon, but one, of course, that one tends to associate with a certain empiricist conception of science, but there it is. What I want to do now is discuss a very peculiar concept in Jung, that of the daimon. J.B. Lang was a friend of Jung, and he thought that Jung should be much more overt about the religious aspect of his thought. The conventional view is that Jung considered religion as a tool that aids the process of what he calls individuation. On such a model, the individual is on a path to self-fulfillment and self-realization. Self with a big S in Jung. From this perspective, Jung looks like a paradigmatic harbinger of modernity, a modernity emancipated from transcendence, in which the autonomy and development of the individual agent is paramount. Against this interpretation, it should be clear, however, that what Jung calls archetypes, which are absolutely key to his theory of the unconscious, are energies and powers that embrace an individual from without, as it were. The agent must negotiate not just the repressed psychic powers of the unconscious as unveiled in Freud, but has to engage with these energies that intrude and disrupt the psyche. Hence, rather than being the typical advocate of the modern secular outlook, like that of Freud, Jung represents a critique of the modern view of the psyche. I'll give you a quotation from Modern Man in Search of a Soul. I am accused of mysticism. I do not, however, this is Jung speaking, myself responsible for the fact that man has, everywhere and always, spontaneously developed religious forms of expression, and that the human psyche from time immemorial has been shot through with religious feelings and ideas. Whoever cannot see this aspect of the human psyche is blind, and whoever chooses to explain it away or to enlighten it has no sense of reality. So, pretty strong words from Jung. But throughout his career, of course, he had this ambivalent relationship to religion, but a profound sense of the significance of mythology for the health of the psyche. And the role of the demon here is particularly, or the daimon, I should say, is particularly significant. Who has the vocation? Here's the voice of the inner man. He is called. And so it is the legendary belief that he possesses a private demon who counsels him and whose mandates he must execute. It's also a theme in Jung that has found resonance with his followers. One might think of James Hillman. Sooner or later, something seems to call us onto a particular path. You may remember this something as a signal calling in childhood, when an urge out of nowhere, a fascination, a particular turn of events, struck like an enunciation. This is what I must do. This is what I've got to have. This is who I am. Of course, the background to Jung's discussion of the daimon is the idea of the unconscious. It may be thought that we have now left the dimension of the scientific here. Many contemporary thinkers who present human nature in terms of evolution, our genetic inheritance, brain processes, and the cultural context won't be impressed by some of this language. But if the term unconscious presents philosophical problems, the idea of consciousness is no less enigmatic. If the conscious experience of the world is deeply mysterious, how much more so dreams? Now, the power of the idea of the daimon, especially as presented by Jung, is that it presents to the human being as being more than nature or nurture, but requiring initiation into a tradition of wisdom that calls forth and cultivates the daimon. Freud, of course, considers that mental life should be thought of in material and mechanical terms, matter in motion, and he thinks of the human being in largely mechanistic, materialistic terms, the nervous system and its muscles. While there's an evident analogy between the Socratic ideal of self-knowledge and Freud is simply not curious beyond the aim of therapy being to become as self-aware as possible. The goal is really rational control. He was aware, of course, of the Pandora's box he was opening. In 1926, on his 70th birthday, Freud wrote, "The poets and the philosophers before me discovered the unconscious. What I discovered was the scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied." So the quotation shows that Freud knew he was not the first to use the idea of the unconscious. And of course, he was addressing particular clinical problems. As Alistair MacIntyre once wrote, "What problems are these? They are the problems of self-knowledge, or rather a lack of self-knowledge, and of the relationship of both to our actions." One of Freud's insights, and here he has been anticipated by both Plato and Augustine, was that these problems are inseparable, that there is no adequate solution to any of them that does not involve a solution to the others. Now, both Plato and Aristotle were fascinated with the Delphic imperative, gnothisiau ton, know thyself. They knew that Apollo's injunction is linked to the problem of human misery. And one of the central problems, of course, of ancient Greek thought is that of suffering. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why it's so relevant today. But Jung, unlike Freud, was much more attuned to the enigmatic and mysterious dimensions of the psyche, those aspects of human experience that elude quantitative scientific analysis and grounded in the depth of the soul. In the mysterious and posthumously published Red Book, Jung repeatedly recounts meetings with the mythic figure of Philemon. Jung recounts that he first encountered Philemon in a dream, in which he saw Philemon flying in the sky with kingfisher wings. Apparently, shortly after this dream, Jung found a dead kingfisher in the garden, kingfisher being a symbol of peace and love, sometimes known as the Halcyon bird. Now, this is a highly controversial literature about Jung's spiritual ambition here, from biographers accusing him of trying to create a cult or some Nietzschean substitute religion. He came from a theological background. His father, Paul Achilles Jung, was in fact a Protestant pastor. But I think this treatment of the daimon, particularly these observations in the Red Book, show that he was aware of metaphysical and deeply religious implications of this idea. Now, the thought is that archetypal powers are operating on the soul, but the healthy agent should not identify with these archetypes. This is, I think, the point of his treatment of the daimon. Individuation means engaging with archetypes imaginatively while conscious of the perils. Let's try to spell out what this might mean. Identification is the source of danger. If the good life is to be a vehicle of higher principles, identification is nevertheless hazardous. He writes in 2 essays on analytical psychology, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of false wrappings of the persona, on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. So both to divest the self of as the false persona, but also there's this inherent danger of the power of these archetypes. Above his house in Küsnacht, Carl Gustav Jung had the following words inscribed: Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Bidden or unbidden, the God will be present. This idea behind Deus vocatus is the ancient motif of the deity in disguise. Ovid recounts the tale of Baucis and Philemon, a humble elderly couple who welcome Jupiter, aka Zeus, and Mercury, aka Hermes, as poor strangers. The gods reward the elderly couple for their generosity, and while the couple express their wish to remain united, their house is turned into a great temple, and they become trees whose branches are intertwined. It's a very beautiful myth. Now, it's archetypal, of course, for Jung, and has parallels with the visitations of angels in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The moral of these tales, of course, is a sort of critique of arrogance and obstinacy. And in a letter on November the 19th, 1960, Jung wrote that one needs to keep the door open to the visitation of the god. And he expressly links this to the Delphic oracle and the imperative, know thyself. Now, the point that's important to bear in mind here is that for Jung, the self is not merely opposed to the rational controlling cogito of Descartes, but also the Ich of Freud, both of which Jung regards as reductive views of the psyche. The self is the total of conscious and unconscious elements, but it is not I who create myself, but I happen to myself. There's a quotation. The rational conscious ego is subordinate to what Jung calls the self, and the spiritual life consists in the integration of elements of this, of the ego and this self, capital S. One might note, moreover, the central importance here of the Iranos meetings in the 1930s, which Jung presided over. At a villa close to the wonderful Lago Maggiore, there is a stone sculpture with the inscription Genio Loci Ignoto, to the unknown genius of the place. He says of those meetings, there was a daimon in me, and in the end its presence proved decisive. He who has vocation hears the voice of the inner man. He's called. And so it is the legendary belief that he possesses a private daimon who counsels him and whose mandates he must execute. Last week, I was talking about the great friend of C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, who in his work, Poetic Diction, wrote the following words. He says there's been no better characterization of the distinction between Platonism, tout simple, and Neoplatonism than was made by whoever defined the latter as Platonism plus the concept of genius. Bear in mind that genius is the translation of the daimon. At all events, it seems to me, in this sense, that the stream of thought to which I referred may be properly termed Neoplatonic, Plotinus, Plutarch, Iamblichus, Synesius, Augustine, Ficino, Bruno, Boehmer, Henry Moore, Shaftesbury, Blake, Goethe, Coleridge, Emerson, and Yeats were no doubt very unlike each other in many respects, but they were all aware, in a way that Pythagoras and Plato were not yet aware, of the active role of the individual human spirit. That's in Poetic Diction, page 221. So the idea is that this addition of the daimon through the Neoplatonic tradition is adding an element of subjectivity to the strand coming from Pythagoras and Plato, which is not actually to be found in Pythagoras or Plato themselves. And of course, it's true that the Neoplatonists did develop this idea of the daimon, motivated in part for the reverence for the writings of Plato, also motivated by a fear of fatalism. This was, of course, the age of anxiety. Plotinus was concerned to reconcile various passages in the corpus of Plato about guardian spirits, especially in the Republic and the Timaeus, and Plotinus's accounts of spirit guides is drawn particularly from the myth of in the Republic, where we find the idea that each human being is given a special daimon before birth, and this spiritual companion guides the soul to its destiny. We're told that the soul is subject to the daimon and is thereby bound to one's life by necessity. Ho sunestai ex anances. That's 617 E2-3. And of course, Plotinus is presumably also aware of the daimonion of Socrates, and we know from an incident that Porphyry tells us about in the life of Plotinus, that an Egyptian priest attempted to conjure Plotinus's daimon, but in fact the efforts of the priest did not summon the appearance of a daimon but a god. Because of this experience, Porphyry writes that Plotinus wrote a treatise on the guardian spirit. And here are some lines from Plotinus. For the soul is many things and all things, both the things above and things below down to the limits of all life. And we are, each one of us, an intelligible universe, making contact with this lower world by the powers of the soul below, but with the intelligible world by its powers above and the powers of the universe. And we remain with the rest of our intelligible part above, but by its ultimate fringe we are tied to the world below, giving a kind of outflow from it to what is below, or rather by an activity by which that intelligible part is not itself lessened. So, on this model, each soul is a universe that consists of different levels of reality. The principle immediately above the level chosen by the soul is the guardian spirit. For the sage, who lives a life in accordance with the divine intellect, the one, the supreme principle, is the guardian. Hence, for Plotinus, it's clear that the soul is a composite, rather fecund unity, which we have to distinguish in the process of reflection, but in reality can't be divided. For intellect is active in the good man. He is then himself a spirit, or on the level of a spirit, and his guardian spirit is God. Now the God who is the philosopher's daimon in this passage is the one and the intellect transcending any domain where magic or theurgy can have any effect. So Plotinus is agreeing with Plato that the daimon represents the providence of God and divine care for mankind. The influence of this has been considerable, and I'll just give you a beautiful passage from one of the most eloquent of philosophers, and perhaps one of the most influential philosophers of the entire 18th century, Lord Shaftesbury, 1671 to 1713, who said once that the ancients believed we have each one of us a daimon, a genius, an angel or guardian spirit to whom we are strictly joined and committed from our earliest dawn of reason or moment of our birth. The Romans called this genius and the Greeks the daimon. In the Christian West, this has of course become the guardian angel. And Shaftesbury links this to the tradition of the Delphic oracle. Shaftesbury construes gnosis as recognize yourself, which is as much to say, he says, divine yourself or be too. This is the passage. That we have each of us a daimon, genius, angel or guardian spirit, to whom we are strictly joined and committed from our earliest dawn or reason. This opinion, were it literally true, might be highly serviceable, no doubt, towards the establishment of our system and doctrine, for it would infallibly prove a kind of sacrilege or impiety to flight the company of so divine a guest, and in a manner banish him from our breast, by refusing to enter with him into those secret conferences by which alone he could be enabled to be our advisor and guide. So he's talking, of course, about the daimon. But I should esteem it unfair to proceed upon such a hypothesis as this, when the very utmost of the wise ancients ever meant by this daimon companion, I conceive to have been no more enigmatically to declare that we had each of us a patient in ourself, that we were properly our own subjects or practice, and that we were then became due practitioners when, by a virtue of an intimate recess, we could discover a certain duplicity of soul, and divide ourselves into two parties. One of these, as they supposed, would immediately prove himself a venerable sage, and with an air of authority erect himself our counsellor and governor, whilst the other party, who had nothing in him beside what was base and servile, would be content to follow and obey. According, therefore, as this recess was deep and intimate, and the dual number practically formed in us, we were supposed to advance in morals and true wisdom. This, they thought, was the only way of composing matters in our breasts, and establishing subordinacy which could make us agree with ourselves and be of a peace within. They esteemed this a more religious work than any prayers or any duty in the temple, and this they advised us to carry thither as the best offering which could be made, compositum jus fasque anime sanctosque recessus mentis. The soul where laws both human and divine in practice, pure in the last recesses of the mind. This was among the ancients that celebrated Delphic inscription, recognize yourself, which is as much to say divide yourself or be two. Now, this is Shaftesbury's discussing this idea of the daimon and linking it, and here's the crucial point, to aesthetics. No poet, he writes, can do anything great in his own way without the imagination or supposition of a divine presence. Now, next week we shall be looking at the question of aesthetics and classical German tradition of aesthetics, most of which was derived from Shaftesbury, that of Kant, Schiller, and Gadamer, and we'll see how genius, play, and imagination come to furnish the framework of so much of the philosophy of art. William James once asked why artists find German aesthetics the, quote, abomination of desolation, but I think we can find the real seriousness but also a playful dimension in these texts next week. But let me return now to conclude the discussion to this question of religion and the soul. We might express succinctly the difference between Jung and Freud as this: whereas Freud, religion is infantile. For Jung, it belongs to human consciousness. It's essential for the development of the healthy agent. While Freud explored the unconscious through dreams interpreted as aspects of personal subjective experience, Jung viewed dreams and myths as portals to universal energy, to structures, to archetypes, a priori principles. For Plato, of course, these are the realm of the gods, the ideas. Religion for Jung then becomes less an aberration than a residue of human spiritual experience, and the source of access to the archetypes, or primordial images, is a precious portal to the numinous. Jung resented being called a Platonist, but in a sense he was. This is partly because of some of the common misrepresentations of the Platonic tradition, particularly a world-negating system of abstract ideas. The ideas for the Platonist are energies and powers, certainly not abstractions, and they are often mediated through images or symbols. Let us recall the words of Housing. To understand poetry, we must be capable of donning the child's soul like a magic cloak, and of forsaking man's wisdom for the child's. Let us think about the image of child play in Heraclitus and Plato as a model for the paradoxical seriousness of the play element in culture. Since a significant part of consciousness dwells in symbols, and in the semi-enchanted archetypal realm of fairy tales and myths, in the impersonal and utilitarian bureaucratic world of mankind in Western democracies, we have been alienated from these numinous sources of meaning. And this may explain the continuing appeal of Shakespeare throughout the centuries, Lord of the Rings, or the Narnia tales. To the bureaucratic mind, these are perceived as childish things, frivolous. But these are so often grim realities. On November the 29th, 1917, C.S. Lewis turned 19, and it was his first day in the trenches of the First World War, amid the harrowing and monstrous carnage of the Somme. He subsequently wrote, "The first bullet I heard whined like a journalist's or a peacetime poet's bullet. At that moment, there was something not exactly like fear, a little quavering signal that said, 'This is war. This is what Homer wrote about.'" A few months later, his best friend Paddy was killed, and Lewis himself was hospitalized through the shrapnel from the same explosion. Like his later friend Tolkien, who was also injured in the Somme, the exploration of the archetypes was no escape for the traumatized adult into a Peter Pan domain or some Alice in Wonderland area, but the exploration of good and evil, suffering and salvation. Shakespeare's plays are quintessentially archetypal. And perhaps it's no accident that the great revival of drama in the Elizabethan age rested on the legacy of the medieval mystery plays. They also emerged after the chaos and brutal anarchy of the Wars of the Roses. Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth are expressions of primordial energy, of demonic spiritual presences, in the sense that we've explored, that we can perceive in historical figures, contemporary statesmen, women, in family and friends, indeed, within our own souls. The bitterness of sibling rivalry, the ferocity of jealousy, the wretchedness of betrayal, the melancholy of loss. These can be narrated in terms of the abstract axioms of evolutionary psychologists or the sociologist, but are felt to be true through the recitation of the poet. It is not the inventiveness that is the key to the power of their works. Hamlet might be seen as an Elizabethan reprise of the Oresteia of Aeschylus. Yet rather than accusing the Stratford bard of plagiarizing the Athenians' plot, we know it is the archetypal pattern that furnishes the foundational energy. The music of the poet effects its magic with mighty images hewn from the deep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you once again, Douglas, for that wonderful lecture. I know it's going to provoke a very interesting and perhaps demanding question period.
As a screenwriter, actress, karateka, person who does a lot of what John Vervaeke would call participatory knowing, in addition to all the propositional knowing that's embedded in the academic institutions, it's been my experience that academia and play are very far removed from each other. And I'm curious if you have any insights as to how the academic world might invite a more playful spirit into its students.
One of the things that struck me with working on this theme of play actually was the rather paradoxical links between the Platonic tradition and this play theme, as opposed to the more scholastic Aristotelian logic-chopping tradition that has basically dominated our universities. And you can understand why, when you have philosophy as a professional exercise, and I'm very happy that it is, but that the attraction of a heavily conceptual, very abstract conception of the subject the attraction of that is very powerful. So, for example, in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, with the scholastic dominance in the universities, in sort of many contemporary philosophy departments, the emphasis on technical skill, on the seriousness of the enterprise. I think that fits in with a certain professionalization of the subject. But there's a bit of an irony there that, in a sense, the various origins of philosophy lie in poetry. The pre-Socratics are writing in poetry. Plato presents us with these dramas in which we have this very puzzling figure of Socrates, the gadfly, the midwife. There's a sort of comic dimension to him. And there's also a strand throughout the Platonic tradition that I think picks up on this. So I would agree with you that there is a sort of a certain seriousness in the major philosophical strand in the Western university, but there is also, I think, this rather attractive Platonic emphasis upon play, which has perhaps not always been represented particularly strongly in the university. I mean, a classic figure here is Erasmus, right? So, I'll be talking about this in a later lecture, so I won't say too much about it, but it's basically in praise of folly, right? So Erasmus is making an absolutely serious critique of the pedants in the university, right? So his ridicule, which is part of his praise of folly, is ridiculing a super serious, but actually a seriousness disconnected from life, right? So just abstraction for its own sake. And ironically, of course, his praise of folly itself goes back to Paul and the idea of the foolishness of God, which is far greater than the wisdom of men. So there is a side to this that I will be discussing later on.
One of the themes that you've been drawing out so beautifully is that this opposition between play and seriousness is one to be grappled with, and in that sense transcended, that the most serious things can be, in some sense, are playful, while the most playful things can be serious in the deepest way. I take it that's a kind of overarching theme here. Dr. Conlon.
Yes, thank you so much for your lecture. And I quite like the translation of Sophrosine as mental health, because, of course, Sophrosine refers to something abstract, to an abstract virtue, but etymologically it refers to something physical, right? It refers to the phrein or the phrenis in Homer, which is sort of the physical seat and the midriff of the emotions, which I think is quite wonderful. In the same way, mental health refers to something abstract, but is also grounded in something physical. It's health. And I think you've touched, very convincingly on the role that the daimon plays in sort of the creation of Sophrosine or of mental health. And you also mentioned, perhaps not as with as much detail, the strand of Greek thinking, even the pre-Socratic strand of Greek thinking that connects learning to suffering. Right. So I believe you ended with Aeschylus. Aeschylus, as far as I know, is the first one to have this idea, pathimathos, right? That through suffering comes learning, and that gets taken up by Herodotus with pathimata mathemata, right, and through the entire Greek tradition. So I was wondering, I think we all have a sense, especially nowadays, that mental health or virtue is best achieved intellectually or through the daimon. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that suffering plays in self-knowledge and in also in mental health.
Yes, I mean, this of course is a huge topic, but if I might just go back to the Haidt book, where he says, one of the problems with the coddling of children is, paradoxically, it's not at all good for them. That actually they need to build up their immunity, and to preserve the child from certain risks will actually generate greater risks further down the line. So the sort of tough love approach of our ancestors, I think, both in the philosophical tradition and in just the more humdrum traditional parenting methods have much in their favor for just this reason. I mean, I think Pierre Hadot is very illuminating on this with his whole conception of philosophy as a way of life in antiquity, and that linked to the radical shift from the ancient world thinking of suffering as basically the human condition, and how does the sage attain a certain amount of tranquility, a certain relief from suffering, and maybe some happiness, and the modern default assumption that if you're not happy, there's something wrong with you, and maybe you need medication or a good doctor or change your Instagram page or something. But that I think is a very considerable cultural shift.
I wanted to ask you about sublime and play, but I sense that you're going to say something along the lines of wait until next week. So I will. Instead, I'm going to ask you, sort of actually, Dr. Conlon, you gave me a great lead-in. We're talking about a lot of these dual. You can look at play and serious, suffering and learning. I'm also thinking about in the Phaedo 59b, he talks about you can't have pleasure without having pain, that once one comes, inevitably the other will come. I kind of just want to hear your thoughts on why is there a need in these archetypes to have both sides in order to be balanced? What could possibly be the reason in play that I need also to have security as well as to be free enough to make mistakes?
So are you asking me specifically about Socrates' itch or the broader question?
I gave you at least like 4 different points you can soar.
That's too big a question, I'm afraid, Shadi. But what I will say is, and forgive me for going a bit off-piste here, is that when I said that Jung was a Platonist, I said that with a certain element of caution. One of the reasons, I think actually the doctrine of the archetypes is one of the most powerful instances of the continuation of the doctrine of ideas, right? So anybody who thinks the doctrine of ideas, died with Aristotle's criticisms of it, the third man argument is entirely wrong. I think Jung's idea of the archetypes is a instance of Platonism as a living tradition and shaping our culture to this day. However, there is a side to Jung that in a way is deeply unplatonic, although it has certain Platonic roots. And that is the claim that the ultimate principle of reality must be conceived of as having its dark side. So, and this is also linked to his notion of the shadow in the human being. So, of course, Plato has a fairly pessimistic view of the human being. Obviously, Christian theology, through the doctrine of the fall, is inclined to think that we are frail creatures, where there's a dark aspect in our own souls that we have to be aware of. But in Jung, and I think he derives this from a certain German sort of broadly pietistic mystical tradition, figures like Jakob Böhme and Schelling, is going further than this and saying that we have to accept that there is a dark and evil principle at the very ground of being itself. And there's a whole history of the Ungrund or the Abgrund in German metaphysics, which is lying behind this. Now, this is at odds with the Christian Platonic tradition. It's at odds with Plato's notion of the good. And that's an aspect of Jung that is genuinely more Gnostic than Platonic. But so that's slightly, say, off your question, but it's a development of this problem of the relationship between good and evil, between light and and darkness. In the Platonic tradition, the tendency is to see that as privative, so that evil is a privation of goodness, or maybe to go along with some sort of Stoic argument that we have to see a broader scheme in which evil and suffering are part of a broader pattern that is itself ultimately good. But Jung wants to go further than that and say we somehow have to perceive this inscrutable evil aspect of being as being in some sense ultimate. This kind of Manichaean Gnostic side to him.
How do we move poetry into something that is internal to the mind and the soul, into something external that we can touch and see and experience?
Charlotte, you really asked me the most difficult questions.
Solar.
We do that all the time. I mean, that was the point of my Lewis, right? So, I mean, Lewis, right, he's there in the Somme, one of the most horrific battles in the history of mankind. And what does he think when the bullets start firing? He thinks Homer. Heidegger likes quoting Hölderlin and saying, dichterisch wohnet der Mensch. You know, we live poetically. And by that he means, Steven Pinker's a very clever guy, but we simply aren't these sort of evolutionary machines in that sense, because we are hermeneutical creatures. We're products of history. We're shaped by a certain imaginary, whether we like it or not. So because of this inheritance, we interpret the world through a grid. Now, it's not parce Kant, a timeless, a-linguistic grid. It's a grid, a hermeneutical grid that is shaped by language, by words that have their history. We are embedded in a particular imaginary. And so that's why when we encounter objects in the world, when we see people, when we have particular experiences, we cannot help but interpret them poetically.
Dr. Hedley, you gave this wonderful, as it were, play on, consciousness is difficult to understand, all the more so is what is unconscious. And I don't think it's simply a legacy of Freud, but one of the things in our own time that I think no one doubts is that we can be unaware of deep things in us. And in a way, the work of education is to come to some deeper understanding of what's moving in us. You and I both knew a man who had a wonderful way of describing the whole dictum of the Greek tragedies as what moves you, unrecognized, destroys you. I'm just wondering if you would make a comment in relation to that coming to awareness and consciousness, in relation to that beautiful line you shared about poetry having the capacity to ambush the heart.
Yes, I think it's just a simple point that we are deeply mysterious creatures. And obviously from the sort of metaphysical perspective that I'm speaking from, that's because we're amphibious. We're both animals, we're part of the animal world, but we're also part of another world. Now, whether you see that world as simply a cultural world, or you see that as at the same time a spiritual domain, which is where obviously I was pushing the argument today, we are nevertheless extremely complex, even if you, as it were, bracket off the element of transcendence that I was pushing for and simply think of as in terms of this cultural as well as natural aspect. And we need all the help we can get. So why not go to the nuanced and profound works that have enjoyed the continuity of esteem?
Here, here. Join me in thanking Professor Hedley for another wonderful lecture.